Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. Happy to have you guys here with us today. I think we're just giving a couple minutes for everyone to join and had registered. We're just making sure we have enough time for everyone to be on session with us. We will do this in listen-only mode for most of the webinar so that nobody's stepping on each other trying to talk. And when we do get to a Q&A section at the end, we ask that you guys will submit questions via the chat window that you guys have there on the right, as that will be the best way for us to keep it organized. And we'll go ahead and answer those while we're on still. I'll go ahead and kick it off here with an introduction for myself. I'm Jordan Mauriello, currently Vice President of Managed Services at CRITICALSTART. I'll give a little bit of background. Been in the industry about 20 years now, specifically in cybersecurity. Started my career in the Navy, working in the cyber warfare side and communications. Went from that to the Gov sector for a little while and eventually landed at Experian Credit Bureau up in North Texas here in Allen. Spent 8 years there, was global head of security operations, ran all the SOC globally, and through that time had quite a bit of experience working with different managed service providers across different service types, specifically working with several that worked kind of in the detection and response capability space. And we'll use some of that to discuss some of my experience and some of the things we've seen on helping to select what we believe are quality vendors who are looking for quality services in this space. Randy?
Yeah, my name is Randy Watkins. I'm the Chief Technology Officer here at CRITICALSTART. I've been with CRITICALSTART for about 7 years now, so I was employee 5 and kind of helping get us off the ground. And really my job here is two functions. So for quite a while, I've been evaluating all the technologies that CRITICALSTART resells. So we always want to make sure that we're offering best of breed technology to our customers that will provide a value and will kind of add to their security posture and increase their security posture. More recently, I've been in charge of product management over our MDR side, making sure that we're building in integrations that make sense for our customers and also building those same features.
We'll see if we can get the slides to change. There we go. All right, so just a little bit of background about the company. CRITICALSTART's been in business for 7 years. We've had some tremendous opportunity and growth, become one of the largest cybersecurity providers in the region. 2 consecutive years on the SMU's D100 fastest growing privately held businesses. 87% year-over-year growth in 2018. Really significant growth, 400% revenue growth in our MDR business with a very, very high customer retention rate. We're still proud to be a 100% employee-owned company and really work to put our customers first and the brand and roost in their wrist. Our #1 motto as a company is do what's right for the customer all the time. And so as this leads into kind of today's topics, putting the customer first is kind of at the forefront even of our webinar, as this will not be a sales pitch today. What we're going to talk about is kind of industry expectations as a customer. What should you be looking for as you are evaluating potential providers in the MSSP or MDR space? What challenges do they face as providers, and how can you ask questions to help figure out how well have they handled those challenges? How mature is their offering? Are they going to meet your specific requirements?
So like Jordan just covered, we're going to go through some of these challenges facing cybersecurity professionals and leaders in different organizations, specifically as it pertains to identifying different services that you may need to augment your security staff. And these are kind of the challenges. We'll address these one at a time with some supporting facts. But we're going to look at some of the more common problems like alert fatigue, visibility inside of managed services, and the actual ability to respond, which is relatively new in the industry and has really made its own vertical, moving beyond just the management of different products that customers have in their environment.
So challenge #1 is really about determining if your service provider is dealing with the alert fatigue problem. I think most of us in the industry are probably familiar with this term, but I'll kind of define it just for the sake of the webinar right now. So as we define alert fatigue, it is the overwhelming volume of alerts that exceeds an organization's capability to properly triage or analyze what currently exists in a queue. Often what we see as the typical response to this is cutting off sections or priorities of alerts, where we say, okay, well, we're going to deal with just the criticals, or we're going to deal with just the highs, but mediums, lows, informationals, anything out of that, we simply don't have the time or resources to deal with. This is a pretty significant problem as it exists in our industry today. I know a lot of customers face this as one of the reasons that they look to external providers is to try to assist and to help with that problem. But we also see that this exists as a service provider. It's something that we've seen that we've had to overcome. We know other service providers also have to overcome that issue. And we want to talk about what you should be asking or how you should be approaching enumerating where is your provider or potential provider exist in the maturity scale of how they're dealing with the alert fatigue problem.
Yeah, we have some stats up on the screen, and some of these stats are pretty astonishing to think that these exist in our industry. And these are pulled from Ponemon, which is an extremely credible source to build up a business case using their statistics. It's kind of an unbiased third party. It's not manufacturer stats. But the one that really gets me when I look at this list of statistics that we have, oops, did I just stop sharing? There we go. Okay, is the last one on the screen. So 30% of manpower is lost due to duplicate alerts. I have a hard time thinking of another industry where 30% inefficiency is an acceptable number. I mean, that is a lot of lost productivity. That's essentially saying for every 3 analysts you hire, one of them is going to be doing the same thing all day and providing no value. So that's a massive loss to organizations that already have a hard enough time justifying headcount. So really, we need to look at the core problem. How are those duplicate alerts allowed to remain in the system? How are they not getting tuned out? What is a better way to address those alerts? And how can you stop those from ending up in the queue of analysts over and over and over again?
Yeah, and you know, when we look at that kind of repetitive alert problem and excess alert problem, you know, that it's really about manpower waste when it comes to services, right? Because any overhead that they have to do one of 2 things as a provider. Either they have to cut it off at the contract level and say, we're just not going to deal with these kinds of alerts, these types of alerts that are highly false positive prone, or they're going to charge it back to the customer for the excess manpower that's required to deal with the false positives that exist there.
So some more stats that you guys can look at, and these are ones that we've used to build business cases before. But really what we're looking at is the cost to defend against cyber attacks. And where this cost comes from is not the increasing complexity of attacks. It's the quickness to deliver those attacks, the ability to move from exploit to active attack very, very quickly in the environment, and then also the ability to monetize those. So the cost to defend is going up, and that's in both headcount and in product in alerts. So these products that are coming out to identify the new attacks, they're generating a lot of alerts that analysts have to respond to. And like Jordan said, there's 2 ways to address it. You either kind of throw people at it, or you kind of arbitrarily turn things off. And if everybody recalls Target, and that was how the Target breach kind of skated by them. The breach was on the board, it was in the SOC, it was on the TV, but because it was a medium alert, it didn't actually get addressed.
Yeah, so you know, as you're looking at this particular problem, and as the cost to defend has skyrocketed, the cost to attack has plummeted, and even the skill level of the attacker that's required to conduct what would be a fairly sophisticated attack. If we were to go back 5 years, some of the things that we're seeing today that have become commodity would be considered APT style attacks today. Now we have to really evaluate this with more scrutiny. Even when we're looking at our service providers, we have to be asking the right questions of them to figure out how well they can handle this provider to potentially this change in the market as a provider to potentially be able to deal with the problem. So we have a couple questions that we've come up with that we think are very relevant to help enumerate this from a maturity perspective for where the provider is. So for us, we think that one question is the provider able to validate configurations of the product? Right? Are they able to actually go in and ensure that the product is configured properly, whatever is detecting on the network, however they're collecting their data to give visibility? Are they able to go in and do that? Are they adding IOCs to the product? Are they taking away signatures and turning things off to reduce the noise level? Like, how are they approaching that actual problem? And that's important. So you want to know whether you'll be able to validate that as well too. So are they hiding it from you? Can you see that? Two, does the service provider turn off any of your alert feeds? Right? Are they turning off certain threat intelligence sources because they can't deal with the false positives that will exist? Are they turning off certain signature sets because maybe they're a little bit false positive prone? Right? How are they tackling the problem specifically in their environment?
Another one that you're going to want to evaluate is what's the highest volume of alert being sent to the customer, and by which priority and severity. So if they're just escalating things without doing any initial triage up front, what value is that providing to your organization? And how are you expected to take action on that data? So looking for the actionable data and what they're escalating to you, instead of just escalating something because they got an alert themselves, is really going to show what level of value they provide.
So the next problem we want to talk about is gaining complete visibility into what's happening behind the scenes of security operations, right? And there is an approach that has been taken to providing security services that generally adopts the idea that the tools that the provider uses, the capabilities that the provider has, don't need to be the same that the customer actually has. This is usually called kind of a black box approach, and it's actually, in our opinion, damaging to the overall service level, and it doesn't provide the customer any measure of trust, and really removes the capability for the customer to provide accountability back to the service provider. You're left asking many of the questions that we have on the screen right now, like what rules were applied to my events? Who performed the analysis for this incident that we just saw? How long did it take before you started triaging that? What were the results of the security events that were closed? So if they received a bunch of alerts on your behalf, they decided not to escalate. How good of an investigation was done on those? What did they dig into? What was the process? Are they transparent with you about SLA violations? How will you learn about those? Are they going to report them? Do you need to go and look and measure the actual statistics in the platform and figure out whether they had one and then report it back to them? And then how many individuals were involved in the process? And this is kind of the core issue is lack of transparency. And I think we've seen this one for a long time. I know I definitely did. It was a chief complaint I had as a customer of MSSPs, is I felt like the devices that were being dropped on my network were a black box and nobody would answer specific questions about what was installed and how it was configured and what was the signature set. And it didn't really build any trust with the actual provider.
Yeah, I think you're seeing that market demand start to come to fruition. We've heard it from a lot of our different customers, not just regarding our service, but other people's services as well. They want to avoid that black box approach, like Jordan said. So they don't want arbitrary devices that are dropped on their network. They see the different, the different technologies that are in the market that are really disrupting the space, and they want to leverage those technologies. And they're looking for an organization that does more with those technologies. They're looking for somebody that actually leverages those higher end technologies, but more importantly, doesn't remove their access to it. So it doesn't just, complete visibility isn't just transparency into the analyst and the back end processes and the comments and the escalations, but it's also the actual tools that they're using to deliver those services. And if you're paying for a name brand product, you want to be able to use that product in its entirety without being completely limited to whatever the MSSP or the MDR determines is what you should have access to.
So around this topic, I think a couple questions to ask as you're potentially evaluating a provider are, one, will your analysts and my team or analyst operate in the same platform? Right. So if you go in and you're asking that question, and the platform that the provider is using, maybe it's really sleek and sexy, it has all kinds of integrations and fancy UIs, and then you go in and ask, will we have access to that UI? And the provider says, well, no, you guys have a separate portal that you work out of, but you won't see all our tools. I think you should start raising questions at that point, because there's going to be a lack of accountability that you're going to be able to provide.
Yeah, to the point of accountability, will internal communications be visible by the customer, by me? So if they're making comments inside about, this looks weird, or this is strange, or this is normal, we've seen this before, do you actually get visibility into that? If somebody filters out an event on your behalf, they're essentially accepting risk for your environment. So if they're accepting risk for your environment, you're owed an explanation. So if you're not able to see those comments, you should start asking, why can I get access? How do I get access to those comments? Is there a monthly report where I get to review everything that's done internally? Because you do want to make sure that they're responsibly accepting risk if you've chosen to allow them that privilege.
And we also want to ask them about kind of accountability and tracking for actions taken on incidents, especially today as providers are turning towards MDR services, which is detect and respond now, not just fire off an alert and responsibility ends, but we should be able to use our response capabilities to impact the dwell time of the attacker. Right, so how is that being tracked? When is it being tracked? Is there an authorization mechanism if they're going to isolate a system or block an IP address? Is that transparent to you? Will it show in the incident? Is that going to be time logged? Right, all the pieces that would go into you keeping your internal team accountable that you would want internally if you were going to make those changes. The providers should give you visibility to the same thing as well. And unfortunately, we don't see that happening a lot today. So we want to make sure that we're asking those questions too as well.
So getting into the third challenge, how do you determine the ability of a service provider to identify, investigate, escalate, remediate, quickly different security events before they're able to move through your network? And like Jordan was talking about on that last point he made, we're expecting those service providers to lower the dwell time of attackers. So what goes into assessing a provider's ability to quickly identify and, more importantly, remediate those attacks in a way that shows expertise and knowledge? Where a lot of MSSPs and MDRs came from is a network monitoring space. And with network monitoring, it's very binary. It's either, hey, this is either working and it's passing traffic, or something is not working and it's not passing traffic. But with security, there's a completely different mindset. There's a different skill set. There's a big expertise jump to go from is this working or not to is this expected behavior? Can I crack open this binary and determine if this is a target of opportunity or a target of interest? Is this a true APT? Is this a low and slow attack? Are these compromised credentials? And then if I determine that this is bad, how do I respond to it? Do the analysts have the necessary competency to say with a high level of confidence that this needs to be isolated right now and take action on the customer's behalf in a way that's not going to damage the customer because they have 100% certainty?
Yeah, when we look at how the landscape has changed drastically, the sophistication of attacks, but even more so, how quickly an attack turns into something that is impactful to an environment. So there's a difference between an incident and a breach, right? An incident is usually very narrow in scope. We have a single system that's compromised and it hasn't had data loss or something that would be brand impacting. And those happen in every organization all the time, and we deal with hundreds of them a day in our MDR service. Right? When that becomes a major issue is when that becomes a breach, right? And the delineating factor between those is how long is the attacker allowed to sit on that system and dwell, right? Are we able to make impactful actions on the attack to actually stop something like monetizing systems for crypto mining and stealing resources, or leaking valuable company data out, things that would actually impact the brand if they got out and went public. And as we look at those and consider what Randy said and the changing threat landscape, I think that leads us to some of the questions we want to ask around challenge number 3 here too as well. And so challenge 3, I think there are certain measurements that we want to be able to take, but those are going to be specific to the type of provider as well that we're going to talk about.
Yeah, and when you look at the landscape of providers, there are some different options that fit into different verticals. And a lot of times we loop these into one and we say, hey, if you're a service provider, you're a service provider. But when you start laying out your use cases, your needs, what you're expecting that service provider to do, it's pretty evident that not everybody plays in the same field, and there certainly is a fit for each one of these. So we'll kind of go through them one at a time at a very high level, and we can absolutely dive into these a little bit more as well.
starting with the legacy MSSP, and these are your 24/7 compliance checkboxes. They absolutely have a SOC on the back end, but a lot of times they're attacking the problem of triage and response by throwing manpower at it. And their SLAs are going to be wrapped around very tightly controlled correlation rules that are very specific in the alerts that they fire off, so they can try to control that false positive rate and lessen the amount of triage that they actually have to perform.
Yeah, and one of the key things that will drive a differentiator there for that one is it's usually going to be working with whatever hardware the customer may already have, ability to manage on-site SIM tools that already exist in relatively uniform configurations across that. It takes a lot of people, and the cost can be fairly high depending on the specific configuration you're going to go to. The next one would be moving to the MDR space. Obviously, we're in that one too, but other companies like Expel.io, eCentire, Arctic Wolf. And this is where you're moving to having a specific focus as a service provider. And so it's not about meeting a compliance checkbox. It's not about managing the customer's currently existing tool sets. It's about providing a capability. Right? And that capability is to be able to detect and respond to threats in a timely and effective manner. To be able to deal with the alert fatigue problem at scale, and to provide a capability for incident response and investigation that usually would have to be held by the customer, even in the managed services world for MSSP, as a service provider too.
Yeah, and the big thing with MDR, and Jordan touched on it, is leveraging specific tool sets. Because they're dependent on the capabilities of the product to perform things like remediation and response, they won't typically support everything that a legacy MSSP does. So they're going to be relying on some of the more kind of quote unquote next gen technologies that have the capabilities for remote isolation and remote response baked into them. The next one is outsourced security. And this one has a need that is, or it fulfills a need that is far beyond what legacy MSSPs and MDRs provide, because this typically involves having 1, 2, 3, 5, 10 people actually staffed in the organization's environment, in the customer's environment. And they'll take care of everything from firewall changes to patch management, vulnerability scanning. And this is really your outsourced entire security team. Where MSSP and MDR usually try to augment your SOC capabilities and your ability to respond to alerts, triage them, and take remediation actions. The outsourced security model is going to provide the entire security suite up to and including like virtual CISO roles.
Yeah, and usually we see this exist in a certain customer space delineated by size. And so usually you're seeing these organizations work with companies that are 30,000 employees and larger. It doesn't usually make sense for them from a cost and price perspective, even for the provider, simply from a profitability perspective, to work with organizations that are in the mid-market or even smaller enterprise. They really have to work with those organizations that are up in the 150,000 employee range, often are some of the organizations that they're working with. Next is the product vendors. So your CrowdStrikes, your FireEyes, those are going to be organizations that have a very narrow perspective on what tools they're going to use. They're going to use their tool and they're going to bake in their service on top of that. They're usually going to have a high level of expertise in their particular technology set, and the capability will usually be pretty strong in that technology set, but the integrations outside of that are going to be almost non-existent. So they're not going to be able to bring in a lot of logs that are outside of that specific tool set. They're not going to use integrations with other tools to bring in capabilities. So if they are an endpoint vendor, they're not going to put in a firewall block for you via an API integration, right? Those kinds of things are going to be something that are just out of scope. So narrow and focus, one tool set, very good at that one tool set, but maybe lacking some of the broader integration. So specifically on challenge 3, there's a couple things before we get into kind of the high level questions that we'll want to address that will even help you figure out what space are the organizations falling into. One of those is what's the average number of minutes spent per incident prior to escalation to a customer? Right? How long is the organization spending time investigating an incident or alert, depending on terminology, before they're going to escalate it back to the customer. Is this a quality service where they're spending a longer amount of time doing a deeper investigation to determine the cause, to determine the next action? Are they just triaging the alert to try to figure out whether it's a false positive at a certain ratio and then sending it off? Or are they figuring out just how to route it to people that are currently on site? And understanding that will give you an idea for what kind of service and even what kind of organization you're dealing with as a whole.
Another thing that you're going to want to consider is kind of the subjective nature of analysis. So we talked loosely about the different level of expertise that's necessary for MDR providers, people that are providing strictly security services, and really diving into the ability to triage and respond to those. And it's kind of an art form. If you talk to anybody who's done real security analysis, everybody has a different way to do things. They'll go down different paths, they'll look at different processes. You start to develop your own groove, but what's really important is having a consistent outcome from that. So asking questions like, how do you assess the consistency of your SOC given the subjective nature of analysis, and knowing that there's a formal process that's put in place to review those different alerts is definitely something that we've addressed quite a bit from a customer comment and question standpoint.
Another thing that we would ask too as well is about what SLAs they're measuring internally, or specifically is, do they put a measurement around when they detect and when they respond, and are they giving you visibility into that measurement? Right? If that's a key metric for them as an organization, then they're probably leaning into the MDR space or the product vendor space, where they're focused on a higher quality, higher capability service, and away from legacy MSSP and outsourced security.
So this is a kind of a longer list of questions that we would ask. We would have our customers ask of either ourselves or any other service provider in the space, and we will share the slide deck, so no need to frantically write these down or try to take screenshots. But going through some of these, looking for a 1-year contract versus a 3-year contract, there's obviously different appetites for different contract lengths. But with the speed of technology innovation, this is definitely one that I like to point out. A lot of service providers will try to lock customers into that long-term contract, but really we think that you should just prove yourself every time, and then you don't have to worry about the length of the contract because the customer is going to renew. You're going to find value in the service, and you're going to continue with that service. But really it gives you another opportunity to reassess the technology landscape and determine, is that MDR, is that MSSP, is that service provider still representing the best of breed technology that you feel fits best in your environment?
Yeah, I think there's something else next in there. We're talking about what happens to my security tools if I end the contract. And I think the concept of severability is something that's still lost on a lot of service providers, and that customers have to start pushing more for. There's still a lot of service providers that are out there that essentially, when you end the contract with them, your tools and your logs are both removed and you're kind of left high and dry. And I think you want to be looking for organizations that are licensing the tools to the customer and allowing the customer, if they get more mature enough, to take over their own services and that capability if they maybe grow into that. Or even if they don't and they're moving to another service provider, right, they should be able to take data, they should be able to keep their compliance logs with them, things that are mandatory for the business to actually do the checkbox stuff, which we all still have to meet most of the time. It should be able to stay properly compliant as they do a migration.
I like number 7 as well. So is there a 2-person review process in place for rules, detections, filters, logic, tuning? Is there another set of eyes on glass? So I used to do deployment of an application whitelisting tool, and it's extremely effective. I mean, you're essentially saying if it's not approved, it doesn't run. And I would also go in and audit customer environments where they set up their own application whitelisting tool. And the amount of customers I went into where they were essentially saying, hey, anything that runs out of C Windows 10 is good to go, just kind of blew my mind. And the same is possible in a service provider. All it takes is one bad rule to completely destroy the efficacy of that service. So having that 2-person integrity check, essentially one person creating a rule, another person auditing that rule, and then activating that rule, is, in my mind, essential for service providers.
Yeah, and I'll touch on one last one here, and then we'll get ready to open the floor for questions and conversation here. And that's number 10. How is the provider communicating with customers? Can they collaborate and investigate from mobile devices today? And we think this is a core capability that people have to start bringing to the market. Because the fact of the matter is that people are not carrying their laptops with them anymore. And if we go back 10 years, maybe even a little bit further, and the idea that security personnel needed to keep their laptop in their bag, in their car with them at all times so they could be on call, that's an idea that's kind of lost on today's security personnel altogether. And so we have to be able to communicate with people where they are and how they're doing their work, and that's in mobile. So it's a capability that I think people should start to expect from service providers, and not to just simply receive an email that says, oh, you have an incident, log into this system to go look at it, log into our portal or VPN into your network or whatever you need to do to actually see the incident. Now we need to be able to communicate with people in an interactive manner, because if we're, as service providers, not taking ownership of the communication process and making that effective, we're really failing our customers as a whole.
All right, so we'll open it up for questions. We do have a few that are in the chat. So this one is, will you talk about the difference between the MSSP and the MDR? You want to dig into that one?
Yeah, so we can go into that a little bit more. So really, MSSP still exists today and still is a strong market, but it's a little bit of a legacy approach. In that it's still coming to customers and simply saying, well, we'll manage what you have. We're going to take on the burden of providing the people and the expertise to deal with your on-site ArcSight deployment as an instance. Not to knock on ArcSight, it's still a very, very powerful tool, but it is a older SIM tool that's a little bit legacy right now. And that approach is generally solved by putting the experts there to do it. Now, it's still solving a problem for the customer because the customer is lacking expertise very often today. It's hard to find, hire, retain, train up high quality security personnel. Most of you guys on the webinar know that we could leave our jobs today and have another job by Monday very easily in this market. That's just the way it works. It's highly, highly competitive. And so if it's on the service provider to provide that expertise, the value to the customers, they don't have to worry about the people problems on the back end. But what happens with that is there's often a degradation in overall tool quality, production deployment quality, and detection capability, because the tools are not unified. There's not a unified capability. There's no global operating leverage that the service provider is providing back to the customer. And the MDR specifically is going to bring in their tools. Now, they might have a broader set of tools as an MDR. They might have 7 or 8 endpoint technologies they work with, and 2 or 3 network technologies, and a couple different sets that they can bring in, but it's still going to be narrow in scope, and they're going to have very deep integrations with the tools. And the reason they're doing that is they're trying to provide that operating leverage at scale for their business, and then give the quality investigation capability back to the customer without them having to have the people on site to do that themselves. And so the MDR is really trying to do 2 things. 1, attacker dwell time is a problem, and 2, elevate on-site resources for the customer to a tier 2 incident response position where they're not doing alert triage anymore.
Next question is, how would you assess the quality of analysts at an MDR? So there's a couple of different questions that you can ask to get an idea of the quality of analysts there. And the first one is, what's your training program for analysts? So you should look for something that is a multi-week training program with certain functional areas that are emphasized, and not just product support. So Jordan mentioned, MDRs support a somewhat limited product set, maybe a maximum of 15 or 16 technologies across different verticals. They shouldn't just have expertise in those products. They should have some, but they also need to have general security expertise. The ability to crack open a PE and see kind of what the function of that PE is, or triage like actual PDF exploits. They should understand the fundamentals of security, not just how the product displays it. Another thing I would look at is, ask what the growth rate is for analysts. So is there a vertical and a horizontal movement path? Can they take other functions inside the organization? Is there a definitive way for them to move from a tier 1 to a tier 2 to a tier 3 analyst? What growth positions are available? And we talked about the alert fatigue problem, and analysts don't want to just sit there and look at the same alerts over and over again. They want to be challenged by new things constantly, and they want the ability to progress in their career and move up. So if those kind of options for them are stated clearly with clear goals on what they need to accomplish to move, they'll be a lot more apt to stay around, and that keeping those senior analysts longer definitely contributes to the quality. And for that matter, you can ask what the retention rate is inside the stock, and ask, what has the turnover rate been in the last 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, and get a good idea of are they fostering a good grounds for building and maintaining talent, or are they putting people in positions where they aren't going to be successful, they're not being challenged enough, or they don't feel like their job actually is providing value, and they want to move to somewhere they'll be more fulfilled.
And I think that last question, Randy, is pretty revealing too, because analysts don't want to do crappy work, right? They want to be able to provide a quality service to their customers, even if they're a level 1 analyst. And if they're just looking at the same low quality alerts and having no impact on the customer environment, they're not going to be very happy with the job. They're not going to stay there very long. So I think that asking what the retention rate is for analysts in an organization is pretty revealing as to the kind of work the tier 1 analysts are doing for that company.
Last question, it looks like, what SLAs do you think are essential for a provider to measure? Jordan?
Sure, I'll start that one off. I think that the measurements of kind of quantitative analysis that we traditionally see is not necessarily effective to show what the service is providing to the customer. So, hey, we received this many alerts and we sent this many alerts back to you. That doesn't really tell much of a story about what kind of service is being provided to the customer. I think really what we should be asking is, well, what's the time to detect? From when an alert fired on my systems, how long did it take for your organization to pick up that alert and start doing investigation work on it? Right, and then the next one after that is very similar. It's what's the time to response? From when you started investigation work, how long does it take for you to take a response action, either sending that to the customer for approval, tuning or filtering out that alert, or actually maybe quarantining, isolating a system on a network block and IP address, actually impacting the attacker dwell time. I think those are essential metrics today to measure when we're talking about providing a quality service. They're going to tell a pretty transparent story about what the service provider is doing.
So Jordan, playing devil's advocate on that one a little bit, measuring time to respond, how do you combat the argument that may compromise the quality of investigation triage?
I think you have to balance that, right? It's not about doing it quickly, right? It's not about how fast can we go through and do this. It is about finding the right balance. I think most organizations will agree, and there's a couple papers out there that talk about kind of world-class time to response being around 1 hour, and what most people should expect from an organization being around 2 hours. That's kind of considered an industry standard. As you get over that 2-hour line, allowing the attacker to sit on the network for that long starts to become pretty detrimental pretty quickly. So I think there's a balance of, yes, it needs to be measured because we need to see how long we're spending on incidents. Are we putting in quality time? But it's not about how fast they did it. It's about the effort that was done. So you have to combine that with some kind of transparency. So yes, your time to response was 5 minutes for that incident. What was done? Right? Can I see that? Can I see the comments, the investigation steps, the OSINT that was checked, the triage package right on the endpoint and pull back data from? Can I see the decisions that were made? If you can't, then you're definitely going to have an actual impact in a negative way by measuring that. But if it's a fully transparent process that can be verified by a customer, then measuring time to response still mandates an expectation of quality.
Great. I don't see any other questions. So for attending, I'm going to go ahead and share this link in the chat real quick. But essentially, you can download the slides that we used today. You can also download our ebook that outlines a lot of the challenges, some additional challenges that we see in the industry, and also kind of our response to that. And you can also kind of schedule a call or a call with one of our MDR experts. Myself, Jordan, we have a number of folks at CRITICALSTART that are very well versed in SOC, and they've either been a customer or a leader in a SOC in a different position. And aside from that, thanks for attending. Really appreciate the time.
Thank you guys. Thank you for joining us.